School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and president for the academic affairs for the Mount Sinai health system. Dr. Charney.
What's that? Okay. Over here? Does that work? I don't know. Is there a clip? All right. Okay. Okay. You can hear me up there? Yes or no? How about now? Okay. All right. So here's what I hope you gain out of the talk. One is that psychological stress affects brain function, that we've begun to understand the psychobiological mechanisms of human resilience to stress, that you can train yourself to be more resilient, and that it may have implications for your own life. And I'm going to make this talk a little bit personal. So I've been studying resilience for 25 to 30 years. I was never in combat during the Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam era in terms of age, but I never went to Vietnam because I was in college and medical school, so I had that kind of deferment. But I ended up working to understand the biology of depression and stress and discovering new treatments for my entire career. And I learned a lot about war when I became chief of psychiatry at the West Haven VA. And then I began to study post-traumatic stress disorder. And ultimately, with my colleague Steve Southwick, we decided to study resilience, in part to develop better treatments. We thought if we could understand how some individuals are resilient in terms of the effects of trauma, then we could develop better treatments for PTSD. Somewhat analogous to AIDS, where some individuals get affected with the AIDS virus but don't develop AIDS. And that has led to new ideas about treatment. So we ended up studying many hundreds of individuals, including POWs from Vietnam, Navy SEALs, the Delta Force, but also victims of sexual and physical abuse, individuals that were faced with congenital disease, literally every ethnic group you can, and socioeconomic group you can imagine. And ultimately we developed a prescription, in a sense, for becoming more resilient. But I always wondered, whether I was resilient. And I was studying resilience and working with individuals who were resilient. In fact, in many respects, it changed my life. But I didn't know if I was resilient. Late August 2016, I was the victim of a violent crime. As was mentioned, I'm the dean at Mount Sinai. I've been dean for over 12 years. I'm in my 13th year. And around 2010, we decided that we had a faculty member that was guilty of scientific misconduct. I didn't know the faculty member very well, but through the process of evaluation of the misconduct and a tribunal and so forth, it was decided he should be terminated as a faculty member. So we terminated him in around 2010, and as being the dean, I make the final decision, although I didn't know the individual very well. In 2016, he tracked me down 6 years later in my hometown and shot me with a shotgun. Coming out of a local deli that's a legendary deli in Chappaqua, New York. You know, I was coming out, and all of a sudden, I felt first I heard a loud noise like a boom, and then I looked at my shoulder, and I saw blood coming out, and I realized I was shot with a shotgun from 20 feet away. And I turned and went back into the deli, and then the recovery period, you know, started in terms of getting me to a hospital. There were a couple of things that, you know, happened during that acute episode. You know, one, when I got back into the deli, there were heroes in the deli. So this was, think of Cheers. Those of you remember that TV show. Everybody knows your name in this deli. I would go there every morning, get the same thing. And there were a couple of people who ran, you know, to my assailant, you know, to prevent anything from happening to anybody else. And other people kind of ran the other way. But there were, you know, ordinary people active heroically. When I went into the deli, I didn't pass out, which was good. I did a back of the envelope assessment, you know, whether I was going to live or not. And I felt I was going to live because I didn't pass out and so forth. There was another customer there who said, "You're going to be all right." And I thought to myself, wait a second, he's not a doctor. But I'm a doctor. And so I did ultimately feel I was going to be all right. The police got there, and they went right at the assailant. You know, so, you know, when you see, and look, I'm speaking to an audience that sees this all the time or learns about it, but I saw it in real time that the police were called. They got there very quickly, and they went toward the assailant and corralled the assailant and arrested the assailant. But they ran, you know, toward danger to save other people's lives. So I got taken to a local hospital, a local trauma center by ambulance. My family was immediately, you know, called and ultimately got there very quickly, and I was evaluated there. One of the police officers followed the ambulance, Police Officer Davenport. And when I got to a room there, I was being evaluated, he sat outside the door. And when I was about to be transferred, because I wanted to be transferred to Mount Sinai as soon as possible, when I was about to be, you know, transferred, my son, who was there, he's a physician, he said thank you to Police Officer Davenport, who was sitting right outside my room to protect me, as you know, in case something else happened. And Police Officer Davenport said, I'll never forget this. First, he was off duty, so he heard about it, you know, through the police dispatcher, and he followed the ambulance. He was off duty. He's sitting outside protecting me. He didn't know my family, and he just said to my son, "I just, you know, wish I was there to take the bullet." Didn't know him. Know him now. He's become a friend of the family. And ultimately, I got transferred to Mount Sinai. I was in the ICU for 5 days. I lost, you know, half my blood, but I'm fine. You know, I'm totally, you know, recovered. I'm an athlete, a weightlifter, and you know, I'm back, you know, to where I was. In fact, it was a fairly quick recovery. But I'm going to talk about resilience in the context of how I dealt with my my trauma, which was obviously totally unexpected. One little funny part of the event is, when I was walking out of the deli, I was turning toward my car, and then I got hit by the shotgun, and luckily I was turning, because if I wasn't turning, I would have been hit you know, face on, and I wouldn't have made it. But I was turning and got hit here, and in fact the 15 pellets are still in the shoulder. But I was holding a bagel, because I always got the same thing, a bagel in my left hand and iced coffee in my right hand. And so I get shot, I turn, I go back into the deli, and it turns out, you know, I got hit in my right hand and I dropped the coffee. I held on to the bagel. So the bagel was subsequently found where I was sitting when I got back into the deli. But it does change your life. And so I learned a lot about trauma by not only being a researcher, but I learned about it firsthand. So we have studied resilience first in the following way. So with my colleague and one of my best friends, Steve Southwick, we went into studying resilience with a blank slate. We didn't know what it took to become, resilient. So we decided to study resilient people and learn from them. And then ultimately we started hearing the same thing over and over again. So these are some of the people that we got to know and study. This is Jerry White. Jerry was 18 years old. He just finished his freshman year at Brown. He went to Israel, although he's an Irish Catholic, to follow the paths of the prophets during the summer with his friends. And he didn't read Hebrew, and he went into an area that said, don't go in this area because there are landmines. But he went into that area, and he stepped on a landmine. And it blew off, part of his leg. And his buddies, went in to save him at great personal risk, ultimately got him to a hospital. And he was in the hospital. He had an amputation of his leg, and he was feeling very depressed. And an Israeli soldier, first his mother was saying, why don't you come back, get treated at Mass General. He lived in Boston. And he said to his mother, the Israelis know how to take care of this. They've had experience, unfortunately. And so Jerry was feeling depressed, and an Israeli soldier walked by him and then came to Jerry and said, which leg, do you think I lost? And Jerry said, I don't think you lost any leg. You're walking perfectly, well. And the soldier said, I lost both my legs. And he said to Jerry, did you keep your knee? And Jerry said, yes, I kept my knee, which makes, as you know, makes a big difference in recovery. And then the soldier said, don't worry, it's like a nose cold. You're going to be fine. And that really helped Jerry. That soldier became a role model to him. So what did Jerry decide to do? Well, he decided to devote the rest of his life to rid the earth of landmines. And with Ken Rutherford, Ken's over there on the left, decided to form the Landmine Survivors Network. And you can see Princess Diana there in the middle. And this network has done a lot for ridding our planet of landmines. And in 1987, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So we learned a lot from Jerry. We learned a lot from people like Deborah Gruen. Deborah Gruen was born with spina bifida, which many of you may know is a problem with a congenital problem with the spine. It causes short stature. It can cause problems with genital and urinary function, among other things. My family knew Deborah from when she was born. My kids babysat for her. She was born optimistic. She was born can-do. And ultimately, she swam, became a swimmer, swam in the Paralympics, won gold medals, went to Yale, was valedictorian of her high school class, went to Yale, swam on the Yale swim team, the varsity swim team, because the coach said, I want you on my swim team because you're a role model to my other swimmers. Ultimately, she went to law school and is now a prominent lawyer in New York City. Optimism. She was born optimistic, which is a feature of resilience. And as I mentioned, we studied the POWs from Vietnam, and this was a life-changing experience. Steve and I were able to contact and study the POWs through a contact at the POW Center in Pensacola, Florida. And we ended up interviewing over 40 of them. We did neurobiological studies on them, which I'm not going to talk about today. but we learned a lot from them about resilience. And as many of you know, many of the POWs in Vietnam ended up doing very well, and that's why we wanted to study them. We wanted to know, how did that actually happen? So this is a map of the prison there in Hanoi. It was nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by Bob Shoemaker, who we ended up interviewing. And these are drawings from John McGrath, which illustrates, what was it like as being a POW in Vietnam. There was no Geneva Convention protecting the POWs. They were heavily tortured. Many of them were in solitary confinement for years. They were beaten. This is called the ropes, in which many times their shoulders were dislocated. Another form of physical torture. Many times when they were in solitary confinement, they were unable to move. They were waterboarded. One of the things that was very helpful to them, in fact critical to their survival, psychologically and otherwise, was that they used the tap code. In fact, the tap code was developed in Korea, in which you could communicate through barriers like walls. And then one of the POWs knew about the tap code from Korea and taught the tap code to other POWs, and that became very important in their ability to communicate and to deal with the POW experience psychologically. And this is the tap code. So it's 5 rows of 5 letters. So if you tap once, that's row 1, and then you tap 3 times, that means letter C. Now, we have 26 letters in the alphabet. So C stood for K. And they got to the point where they could talk to each other like in paragraphs, by knocking like this. And they illustrated that to us when we were interviewing them. And they told us that without that tap code, in providing support to each other, they would not have survived. And many of them became best friends for life through this experience. And when they tapped, they told each other the most intimate aspects of their life and what they were feeling, even though many times they never saw each other for long periods of time. The analogy that we take from that in terms of being resilient and handling trauma is that everybody needs a tap code. They also told us about exercise. So many of them, particularly in the beginning, were held in very small cells, 6 feet by 8 feet, etc. And they told us repeatedly that the physical exercise was very important for their self-esteem. And eventually, later on in the POW experience, they got into bigger rooms, and they used to have weightlifting contests, or push-up contest, or sit-up contest. And one of the guys we interviewed, who was one of the toughest, Rod Knutson, but was pretty small, and they told us that they used to use him as a weight in the contest. Although Rod told us that he could do like 1,000 push-ups himself, and used to walk around the room on his hands. This is Camp Alcatraz. This was part of the Hanoi Hilton for the POWs that were most heroic and were the bad prisoners when it came to how they dealt with the captors. And we interviewed most of these men, and most of them did very well. So there are stories about each one of them. Jeremiah Denton became senator from Alabama. Samuel Johnson became a representative from Texas. One great story is from Tanner. So they were heavily, Stockdale won the Medal of Honor. The one story that we always remember from Tanner, so they were, the captors attempted to put them in front of TV cameras to use them for propaganda. And they always tried to, refuse that, but they would be very heavily tortured if they did. And there was one time when Tanner was supposed to go in front of the cameras, and he didn't want to. He described to us how he got down and prayed to determine what he could do, because he felt if he didn't, he would be tortured to death. So he went in front of the cameras, and they asked him a series of questions, and this was broadcast, to the United States and other places. And they asked him, among other things, who was his squadron leader, and he said Clark Kent. And then he gave other names of who was in the squadron. Now, the North Vietnamese did not know, who Clark Kent was. But eventually they found out, and he got heavily tortured. But it gave the message to our Department of Defense that the men were being heavily tortured. It's an example of their heroism. So we interviewed many of them, as I mentioned. We interviewed Bob Shoemaker. He nicknamed the prison the Hanoi Hilton. Many of you probably recognize this photograph when Bob was released. He was the second longest held prisoner from 65 to 73. That's his wife, Lorraine, and his son. So when Bob was in solitary, he built a house in his mind. And this is a common story. So he built a house in his mind, room by room, cabinet by cabinet, etc. And when I met Bob, he was having a fight with Lorraine because she wanted to renovate the kitchen. And he said, no way, that was not going to happen. His son there eventually became a neurosurgeon, and Bob ultimately became an admiral. So he told us a lot about the importance of support and optimism and never giving up. But, this is when we interviewed him. In fact, we did these interviews at NIH, when I was there in the early 2000s. So these are some of the areas that we identified through the many hundreds of interviews we did with the resilient people that I mentioned, not just the POWs. We found optimism is extremely important. It is very much related to resilience, but it's not Pollyanna optimism, and Stockdale made a big point of that. If it's unrealistic optimism, that gets you killed. It's realistic optimism. In part, it's that you assess your situation and you know that you're in deep trouble, but you also have the feeling that you will prevail. So you know what you're in for, but you have the confidence through your training, for example, in the military, that you will prevail. And there's now a lot of work on the neurobiology of optimism, using imaging studies and so forth, and it involves reward circuits as an example. We also found that cognitive flexibility through reappraisal is very important. And I found that personally important in terms of my own trauma. You've been traumatized. You can't undo the fact that you've been traumatized. It happened to you. But you can reevaluate the meaningfulness of that event. And ultimately, you can receive benefit from stress and trauma, post-traumatic growth. And what happens is you reframe the trauma, you assimilate it into who you are, because it's not going to go away. You accept it, and then you recover. And you also realize that failure is an essential ingredient for growth. In terms of my own experience in recovering from trauma, a couple of things happened. One, in my recovery, it was a very public recovery. As mentioned, I'm a dean of a medical school. I was hospitalized in my own hospital. All the students and the faculty were aware of what happened to me, and they saw, how I was dealing with my recovery. So that became very meaningful to me, but it became very meaningful to them. You know, I became a role model in terms of how you handle it. And 6 to 9 months later, the medical students developed an award in my honor, the Dean Charney Award for Resilience. And so that's where not only, and that's the best award I've ever got, not only did I benefit from that, because it made me a stronger person, but I was able to be a role model. We know a lot about the biology of cognition and how memories are handled when it relates to trauma and where in the brain. And this relates to what I was telling you about optimism, and it's been called the Stockdale paradox after Jim Stockdale. This is the kind of optimism that is very important. That is, you retain the faith that you will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties, and at the same time confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, no matter what they are. And I know how important that is for warfighters. So we ended up studying what we found in the interviews in a more objective way. For example, I gave a talk like this a number of years ago, and in the audience was a Pakistani psychiatrist. And recently there was when I gave the talk, there was an earthquake in Pakistan that killed 250,000 people. And he said he wanted to go to the site of the earthquake to understand how people were recovering. And so we helped him with that. We translated some of our scales to Urdu, and at some personal risk, he went to a very remote area between Pakistan and India to study this population. Very different population in terms of ethnicity and so forth. And he found that dispositional optimism was very important in how these earthquake victims in a remote South Asian population ended up doing. So it goes across different groups. Optimism is important regardless of culture of origin. We also found that it's very important to embrace a personal moral compass. For some people, this is religion in the traditional sense. But in others, it's a set of core beliefs that few things can shatter. It also is associated with altruism, giving back to others. Very important. Like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And now in terms of Wounded Warriors. That organization, I'm sure, is very helpful to the veterans who were wounded. Not only, so it's helpful to them, and it's helpful in terms of who they want to help. Survivor Mission. We know a lot about the neurobiology of this. Now, it's not just religion, though. It's a set of it's a moral compass that's also important. And there's one story we have from the POWs where there are two POWs who were living in the same cell, very close, helped each other. One was very religious. He prayed every day, got great comfort from praying. The other was a salt of the earth kind of guy. He cursed a lot. He didn't care much about religion, but he saw how his cellmate was getting so much benefit, from praying every day. So he said, okay, I'm going to be religious. I'm going to pray every day, and I'm going to stop cursing. He did that for a year, and then he said, it's not helping me. So it's not for everybody. But for many people, it's very important. So we studied this too, the role of religion and a moral compass in a very different population, an African-American population, in fact, not too far from here. So again, some of this work I did when I was at NIH. So we decided to study a population at Howard Medical School, an African-American population, that was exposed to a lot of violence, physical and sexual violence. And we wanted to understand what were the factors that enabled this population to be resilient. And we found that purpose in life and religion was very important. Religion in the traditional sense. measured through a scale purpose in life, the more meaning they had in their life, despite being traumatized, the better they did. And attending religious service was important. The more they did, the better they did. Some of that will relate to the beliefs associated with their religion, but also they got a lot of emotional support from going to church. Going back to that Pakistani earthquake population, here we found that religion was very important, but in a negative sense. That many of the individuals who were doing badly felt that God had punished them because they had sinned, even though they hadn't sinned, but they felt that they were being punished. So religion was important, but in this sense, it was very different. These are some of the other things we found that are related to resilience. Find a resilient role model, very important. In fact, in many cases, the recovery from being traumatized is that you have found a role model who went through the same thing. I'm sure that's very important in combat. Maybe among the most important things. In terms of my own experience, several months after I had pretty much fully recovered, there was a shooting in New York City at Bronx Lebanon Hospital, where a disgruntled former physician was able to get a rifle into the hospital and shot many people, including two young physicians in training. And those two who were very badly injured were transferred to our hospital because of the extent of their injury. And one of their treaters came to me and said, one of them's having a difficult time, psychologically. And they thought it might be helpful if I went to see him. And I went to see him. And here I said to him, I may be the dean, but in this case, I'm your brother. Because I know what you're going through. I know what the process of recovery is going to be, both psychologically and physically. So I became a role model to him, and that became very helpful in his own recovery. So it's very important that you find role models going forward. And the POWs told us that over and over again. This is Steve Long, who we also interviewed. And when we asked him about role models, he said the other POWs were my role model. And, it's well known that John McCain was offered early release, but so were most of the other POWs. He was not unique in that. Many of them were offered early release, and they all said no. They all said, I'll go when everybody else goes. And so they were all role models to each other. Face your fears. Another important element of becoming more resilient. So fear is normal. Fear is a guide. If you don't feel fear, you're going to get killed. You got to understand that fear, and you got to learn from it. Facing your fears increase your self-esteem. And we know a lot about facing your fears. It was mentioned in the earlier talk about extinction. There's also a concept of stress inoculation, which you use in your basic training, and other kinds of training to train 18-year-olds from Nebraska to become warfighters, or somebody from inner city New York to become a warfighter. You're teaching them how to face their fears and even become inoculated to the effects of stress. And also we found that if you've been traumatized, you need to be active. You can't be passive. You have to cope in an active way to reach out to get help. And in each of these areas, we know a lot about the neurobiology. This is Terry Cole. So Terry was an instructor in the Delta Force. And so we would ask him, you guys feel fear? And he said, of course we feel fear, but we're trained to cope with it. And he described how you become get to the point that you can jump out of an airplane at 20,000 feet in the dark in enemy territory. And he said it starts one experience at a time. First you might jump out at 10,000 feet, over a cornfield, and then it ultimately progresses that you feel you can do it. Now he did tell us that if you're in the training and you refuse to jump once and then you refuse to jump twice. If you refuse 3 times, you're out. So you got to get to the point that ultimately you do have to jump, but there is a training that you get to the point that you can face your fears. And here are 2 other very important areas. So you can see we have a prescription here to become more resilient. A supportive social network, extremely important. Very few can go it alone. I found in my own experience that the support I got from my friends and my family and the medical school was critical in my own recovery. You cannot do it alone. Considerable emotional strength comes from close relationships with people and organizations. It is a safety net in times of stress. And as I mentioned before, physical well-being is very important too. And so we studied this in objective ways. And here we studied soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and identified the importance of social support. If you didn't have social support when you came back, you did very badly. This is Lou Meyer. Lou was a firefighter in Vietnam, so he was not in combat, but he followed the troops to put out fires. And he was held in the Hanoi Hilton. He became very close friends with Jim Thompson, who became a cellmate and was very close to death. And they decided that they were going to escape. Not many could escape, from the Hanoi Hilton, but he decided he was going to escape. He and Jim trained themselves physically to be able to do that. He got to the point that he could run 24 hours without stopping in the cell. He did the JFK-12. So John F. Kennedy, when he was president, formed the Commission for Physical Well-Being, and they developed 12 exercises you can do without having to go to a gym. Push-ups, 5 minutes, and so forth. And so he used the JFK-12 to get in shape. And he told us he got to the point that he could do 61 push-ups. And I thought, that's pretty good, but I could do 100. But then he said, one arm. He ultimately became the fire chief at San Diego. And these are, ultimately we have 10 factors, and these are the last 2. And that is to train to be more resilient. You can do it. And to recognize your own signature strengths. And this is a pathway to become more resilient that puts together all the things that we identified in our research. Okay, so, given I have 5 minutes, I want to go to some of the biology then. So there's genetic influence on resilience. Resilience is about as genetic as vulnerability to anxiety and depression. So I'm sure you've all known people who just seem to be born with resilient. But it's not, genes are not destiny here. You can train yourself to be more resilient. But we as a field have identified genetic influences on resilience in terms of specific neurotransmitters and neuropeptide. I want to highlight neuropeptide Y. One of the reasons that we became interested in neuropeptide Y is because we were lucky enough to study soldiers doing the SEER course. How many of you know about the SEER course? So this is a unique audience. Usually nobody raises their hand. So this is among the most rigorous course is given in the Army and in the Navy with the Navy SEALs. So we were able to study the impact psychologically and chemically during the SEER course. And as you know, it has these different components. The soldiers are taken POW and taken to a mock camp and are interrogated psychologically and physically. And so we measured what happened in terms of hormones during this during the course. And we found that cortisol went up. We found testosterone went down, not good. Has implications, you know, for the role of testosterone under stress. We found neuropeptide Y went up. Neuropeptide Y is an anxiolytic neuropeptide found in, you know, all of our brains. Thousands of studies have been done to show neuropeptide Y is anxiolytic in animal studies. We studied the Navy SEALs during their course in Coronado, where they're taken out into the bay, usually in cold weather and the wind at night, go off the boat and have to swim a mile undetected to land at a certain place and then do some other things. And we measured the neurochemical and hormonal changes during that stress. Neuropeptide Y went up. In both groups, the higher the neuropeptide Y went up, the better they did. So we decided, and I'll skip something here, we decided to make neuropeptide Y, and ultimately to determine whether this could be a treatment in enhancing resilience on one hand, and in maybe be a treatment for PTSD. So this is a decade worth of work to get neuropeptide Y made, to get it approved through the FDA that we could give it to humans, and to figure out the dose. So it's not trivial. So we had it made. There are issues around how to get it into the brain, but if you take it intranasal, it will probably get into the brain through a pathway that is well known. We first developed a dose response study. In a phase 1 study with the FDA, you got to go slow and move up to see what the side effects are. And when we first started, we started very low, but then we became aware of these basic science studies by the lab of Esther Saban, where she was giving intranasal neuropeptide Y to rats. And just to summarize it very quickly, she found if you pre-treated the rats with neuropeptide Y, intranasal, they handled the stress better. And if you gave them neuropeptide Y after the stress, they handled the stress better when given after the stress. So it theoretically could be preventative, or it could be a treatment based on the rat studies. When we looked at her studies, we found that our dose was 10-fold too low. So we went back to the FDA, got approval to go up on a higher dose. And so here's where we are now. We published a study last year, and we got up to a dose of 9.4 milligrams. And in a preliminary study in patients with PTSD, when we give neuropeptide Y intranasal, it seems to have an effect. So now we're going back to do a randomized controlled trial with neuropeptide Y. So we don't know if it'll work, but it'd be a very novel treatment. It would be based on animal studies, which unequivocally show neuropeptide Y as anxiolytic, and the human studies that I mentioned with Navy SEALs and the Delta Force. I just want to mention ketamine. So as many of you may have heard, you know that S-ketamine was approved for treatment-resistant depression. That is based on work that I led when I was at Yale. It is my patent that was licensed to Janssen that is now approved for treatment-resistant depression. A couple of years ago, when we were studying ketamine in depressed patients, some of them had been traumatized, at the same time as having depression. And they told us when they got the ketamine that the traumatic memories were reduced in intensity, and their PTSD symptoms also went down. So we decided to study ketamine in PTSD. And this was the study that we published just a couple of years ago, where intravenous ketamine had an effect on PTSD that was clinically relevant. We have patented this, so full disclosure, we have a patent on this now. We're in the middle of repeating this study with ketamine, so we'll see. But it has potential. And so you can see our group is doing a couple things. One, from a psychological point of view, we're working to understand resilience and to enhance resilience through these psychological measures. And at the same time, we're looking for coming up with better pharmacological treatments that might enhance resilience, whether it's neuropeptide Y or ketamine. I'm going over 1 minute. Okay. I just want to call your attention to some really interesting basic science studies done by Christine Denny at Columbia. And it'd be amazing if this is true. What she has done is she's given ketamine, essentially, and then waits a week and stresses the animal. So she gives ketamine or she gives a placebo, waits a week, and stresses the animal. The group that got ketamine had less of a stress response, as if ketamine was essentially prophylactic against the effects of stress. We are now testing that in humans, where we're giving ketamine. A week later, in an ethical way, we are stressing the humans to see if pretreatment with ketamine versus pretreatment with a controlled drug will have a prophylactic effect against stress. So, in the end, the goal of this kind of work is try to understand why some people go up when there's a fire in the World Trade Centers to help people. What is it about this person that can do that? This is Hurricane Katrina. What is it about these people that go to save people at great personal risk? And then, as Bob mentioned, you can take resilience work that we do in individuals, and it enables you to understand what does it mean to, in terms of larger groups. What makes a resilient community? What makes a resilient city? What makes a resilient, military force? You can take what we're learning about individuals and you can expand it to larger communities. Now, I'm from New York, so I'm a little biased. But I think New York and the surrounding areas are resilient. Now, why do I say that? We are, in the New York area, we are a community of immigrants. Most of our families, 2 generations back, came from another place. My grandfather came from Austria. My other grandfather came from Russia. One was a butcher, and the other had a small grocery store. 2 generations, there's a dean in the family. There's many stories like that. And so, in a way, resilience is generational. Maybe in part biological, but it's also transmitted in terms of role models in the family. And also when you have a strong infrastructure, like a fire department or a police department, that can help the community recover, it all results in a resilient community. Thank you very much.